Now that we've mastered the Bootstrap grid system, we're going to take a look at some of the components within the Bootstrap CSS. And the first of those is Navbars. So if you click on Components, let's first have a quick look at these buttons, partly because they're quite nice and pretty, but mostly because they give us the standard color scheme of Bootstrap, which you can obviously mess with if you want, but it's a solid one to at least be aware of. So the names for these buttons follow on into almost every other Bootstrap component. So if you want something to be green, you give it a class of success. Similarly, if you want it light blue, info, orange warning, danger, red, primary blue, secondary white, etc. You can see how that works here. You give it a class of btn to make it a button, and then btn-primary to make it a blue button. Similarly with success, info, warning, danger, etc. So we're going to be using that again and again when we want to change the color of things. But let's jump straight on the right menu here to Navbar. So you might be used to seeing something like this at the top of websites. Usually it's got a logo or something at the top left, maybe some links, maybe a search bar at the top right, something like that has become pretty standard. And the Bootstrap Navbar enables us to set one of these up really easily. And it looks like that. So very pretty. Let's copy the code, have a look at it in our bootstrap.html file, and then see what's going on and how we can edit it any way we like. Okay, there we go. So there it is. In its basic form, it's obviously an attractive and clear navigation bar for your site, which could easily have a logo, some links, and a search box, and can be styled in any way. So let's have a quick look at the code and see what's going on. And this is the first time that we're really investigating the Bootstrap class system. So we'll spend a bit of time on that as we go through the code. So first off, we've actually got a new HTML element type here, and that is nav. This was new in HTML5, and it's essentially a div that's used for navigation. So it doesn't have any properties other than those that a div has, but it does tell the browser that in this section is going to be contained your navigation links for the website. But notice if you replace nav with div here, it doesn't change a thing. So really it's just a semantic thing that makes your HTML a little bit clearer. All right, now we've got our string of classes, and we'll see this again and again in Bootstrap, that you have a certain class to define what this component is. So in this case, a navbar. And then you have some customized classes which change the look or the behavior of that element. So here we've got navbar light and background faded. So feel free to experiment. If we get rid of background faded, then we have the same effect but with no background essentially. If we put that back in, we might want to change it to background success, and that will give us a green background. Could you make it a blue background? Wonder if you managed it. There were two options. Info is our light blue background, and primary is our darker blue background. There we go. Then we've got our first link, which has a particular class of navbar brand. So that means it will be considered the logo for the site, and usually that'll be an image, but in this case it's just some text. Next we have an unordered list with two classes, nav and navbar nav. Just set it up to look and behave like a navbar list of links. Then our first item has a special class of active. So it's a nav item, but it's active, which makes it a little bit darker. So that's for just the page that we're on. And then we've got the link itself, so an A element, and then that has a class of navlink, an href of just hash, so it means it will go back to the same page, and then text of home. Notice we've also got a span with a class of SR only. SR is short for screen reader. So if we want some text or information to be displayed only for we're using screen readers, that is devices for visually impaired people, then we can use that class and it will only display on those devices. Then we've just got a series of links, each of which have a class of nav item, and then the link itself has a class of nav link. So they form these ones. And then we've got a form. We'll be looking at those in more detail in the next video. And it's a form in line, which means that each of the input items are horizontally laid out rather than one above the other. And it's pulled to the right. And XS is one of our options for the screen size. And XS, if you remember, was essentially a 0. So this means it will be pulled to the right all the time. If I change that to MD for medium, then it will only be pulled to right for medium and above sized screens. And below that, it's just displaying normally. So normally you're going to want it pulled to the right all the time, and you achieve that with an XS. Then we've got our form itself. We'll look at that in more detail in the next video when we look at forms, but it's reasonably straightforward what's going on. And then we end the form, and then we end the nav. So essentially, it's a really simple way of getting a nice looking navbar, which we can easily customize in terms of backgrounds, etc. But we don't have to worry about all the floating left, the styling, the spacing, and the fact that it's responsive for different screen sizes. So as well as the responsive grid system, the components are much of what makes Bootstrap so useful. Let's have a look at some of the other options of navbar. So navbar brand we've already seen. Nav we've already seen, that contains the nav items themselves. There are a few other color schemes here. We looked at the background, but you can also change the whole theme of the navbar itself. So we've got navbar dark at the top and navbar light. You can see they've set the background to inverse, which means that the text is white rather than dark. So it's easier to see on a darker background. Notice I didn't put my navbar in a container, because normally you want your navbar to stretch all the way to the end of the screen. But you can do if you want, but it'll look like that, which will be a little bit weird. We've then got some placement, and this one is really useful, the fixed top. So with just a single class, in this case navbar fixed top, you can make it so that your navbar will stay at the top of the screen even as the user scrolls down. So let's see that in action. That's really useful. So let's have a container, and then let's get a bunch of lorem ipsum. There we go, loads of the stuff. Lovely. So now when we look at that and we scroll down, you can see the navbar stays where it is. Can be annoying sometimes on certain websites. Use it carefully, but can also be very useful to keep the navigation right there for the user should they want it. Now the last thing I want to show you is quite fun. Let's say you wanted to have a button on your navbar which hid or showed some collapsible content, which maybe had some more navigation links or sign up to a newsletter or something like that. Then you could use this code. So let's just try it out and see what it does. So I'll put it under our existing navbar, and we'll just comment out the original navbar for the moment. So it's still there when you want to check the code. And there we go. Works really nicely. And let's see what code is doing this. We've got a div with a class of collapse. So that means we're going to collapse this div by default. So it's not showing by default. And it's got a particular ID, which we'll reference later. It's got a class of a background inverse, which means it's got this very dark background and pale text. It's also got a class of PA1, which is a special padding class. We can actually get rid of that and everything will still work fine, but PA1 essentially allows you to add a bit of padding in without doing that manually yourself. There we go. And then we've got our content. with another special Bootstrap class of text muted to get that to display a certain way. If we have a look at that without that class, you can see it's muting the text essentially, giving it that sort of grayer color. Then we've got our navbar in the same way that we're used to, but now this is the clever bit. We're creating a button with a certain class of navbar toggler. It's got a type of button, and it's got some new attributes that we haven't seen before, data toggle. And this essentially means that we're going to toggle the collapse class on the data target, which is the element with ID X collapsing navbar. So what we're essentially doing in the background here, there's some JavaScript connected up to all of this, which will find the button with a class of navbar dash toggler, and then it will look for the data toggle attribute, and then note that as collapse, and then it will look at the data target, and then it will find the element that matches that. So in this case, the ID of X collapsing navbar will toggle the collapse class. So this is the sort of thing that Bootstrap is really useful for. If you need to do something like that, and it's quite common that you might want to, you can do that really easily without having to create custom jQuery or JavaScript yourself. Great. So that's navbars. I'm just going to comment out the collapsible one now. So we'll save it in that form for you. So it looks like a more traditional navbar is there by default. One quick thing to note there is that as this navbar is now fixed, it's not in the flow of the page anymore. So we'd need to give the container a bit of padding or margin at the top to move everything down so that we'd see it. So I'll do it with some naughty inline styles just to show you how it might work. If we give it a margin top of 50 pixels, for example, there we go. Then that'll get it exactly on. Probably we want a bit more than that to bring it down a little bit, something like that. So I'd recommend doing that with fixed navbars. All right, so that's a new HTML element that we haven't met before, but Bootstrap does a huge amount for the ones that we're familiar with as well. And in the next video, we're going to look at two of those, and that is forms and tables.